my name is Jessie Cloy, and for those of us who have, or for those of you who have joined us in the past, thank you for coming back. And if you're new, thank you for joining us. I am a competition manager with Move United, and we're excited to be partnering with Adaptive Track and Field USA to put on our third webinar in this series. And we are recording this, so if you would not like to be seen on the recording, go ahead and hide your video. And the only other thing I have to add, it would be please stay on mute unless you have a question, just so that we limit the feedback as our presenters go through the presentation. So I will turn it over to Phil Galley.
Well, good evening. I hope everybody's happy. Tonight's webinar is going to be on the Level 1 Para Certification Officials course. I sent out emails to everyone that was registered, at least up to the 151 of you that were registered as of yesterday. As of tonight, we have 175. I don't know if all of them will get on, but that's a great turnout, and we really appreciate it. We want to get to at least 500 officials that are para certified by the end of the quad. That would be a great goal for us to do. So let's go there. So tonight we're going to go through the course, which is physically on Adaptive Track and Field USA's .org's website. If you go to the USATF officials section and you see para certification, it will take you to the page in Adaptive Track and Field USA where the course lives. And as the course changes, it changes from time to time because para rules change or we want to add a picture or two. The rev will change, but the content will remain the same. So Jerry Clayton, who is a World Para Athletics technical official and international technical official and a WPA educator, and I, Phil Galley, who is the chair of Adaptive Track and Field USA, are going to deliver the course tonight. The way we're going to separate the course is I'm going to do the first part up through the introductions and up through track, and then Jerry will take over for the field portion of the course. We are going to cover everything from soup to nuts in the course. However, as Jessie mentioned, we have delivered two webinars prior to this one. The first one was on seated throws, and the second one was on the visually impaired. Both of those run probably an hour and 15 or an hour and a half, and they're specific to those particular subjects. So if you want to have more information about those areas that are in the overview course, I would suggest if you didn't attend those courses that you go and view those, or at least go and see the slides for those. Those live on Adaptive Track and Field USA.org under the officials corner, and then under tips and techniques. So you can go there and find them there. Okay, so Jerry is going to drive, and Jerry is going to put up the presentation, and we will, if you have a question. Did you
transfer control over to me yet?
You should be able to, Jerry. Can you?
Okay. Looks like we're going to work here. Okay, stand by.
Perfect. Okay.
And we will go full screen.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Okay. Yep. There we go.
Okay.
Okay. So when I sent out the emails the other day, I sent you a link to this Zoom call, and I also sent you a link to the course, which again lives on Adaptive Track and Field USA, and also a new tool that I came up with this week, which links this course with test questions. So when we wrote the test the first time and published it, it has, as USATF's tests have, a link to the World Para Athletic rules. But but all the answers for the test are also in this presentation. So I wanted, and there have been some confusions when you interpret the rules. So I wanted to link the course with that particular question. So when you take the test, have that tool open, and when you get to that question and you're unsure of which answer, then by all means just jump to that page in the presentation, and you should find the answer that you need. Jerry, the course was developed by the Para Officials Committee, and the Para Officials Committee is made up of all the international technical officials in the United States, plus our best para USATF officials in the US. And so we've come up with this course. This is the third time we've done this course, third quad that we're doing this course. So it should be in pretty good shape by now. Okay, so to satisfy being a para-certified official, you need to pass the test. You need to be an association level or higher official with USATF. And then you must be current with your USATF membership, safe sport, and background. If you are an apprentice and you take the test, we will record those results. We certainly will welcome you to work a para event. We just won't put you in a lead role in that event. And when you become association level, the USATF will issue your certification for this quad. Okay, next.
Steve Kessler just asked if there's a link
To the test?
to this presentation.
I emailed him it, so he should be okay.
Okay.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Sorry, folks.
Okay, if you you pass the test, you need an 80 or better on the test. If you fail the test, then Paul Johnson will write you an email and give you a makeup test. So, but I think with this course and the WPA rules being noted, I think we'll probably eliminate most of the people who have not gotten 80% in the test. Okay, Jerry? So rules are rules, right? We all start with World Athletic Rules. They come down to USATF. They also come down to World Para Athletics. From World Para Athletics modifies those rules for para athletics and gives the exceptions for classified athletes so that they can perform in a track and field event. The other organization in the United States that has an effect is Adaptive Track and Field USA. Adaptive Track and Field USA was the national governing body for wheelchair para sport up until year 2000, when the US OPC took over that responsibility. However, we still remain the generator of the rules and the exceptions for the U14 athletes, the masters and the masters athletes. The other, and there are links in this page to those rules if you have to get to them. The other link on this page is the officials meet management by role document. If you remember, if you remember 2 or 3 years ago, USATF came out with a meet manager by role document guide, and we have taken that guide and modified it for para athletics. So the good news is I took the hammer out and we put the club in. So that we've made the changes. We took the tables out for youth for USATF, and we put in the tables for implement weights for para athletics. All right, Jerry. Oh, good. The train's arrived.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I like it.
So to do para athletics in the United States, we have to decide how we treat each individual athlete, and those athletes that qualify for para athletics are given a classification. And if you want deep knowledge about clarification, on this page there is a document that you can click on that will get you to that, that document. However, I don't think you need to go that deeply into classification. You just have to have a real good high level overview of what that is. So we start with the first letter, and that is either going to be a T or an F, and that means either a classification for track or a classification for field. And then we come up with the first number, and that number will dictate what type of athlete that is. So the level 1 is a visually impaired athlete. A level 2 is an intellectually impaired athlete. A level 3 is an athlete that has some coordination issues. Somebody's on, somebody isn't on mute. Thank you. So level 3, excuse me, the 3 generates coordination issues. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The 4 is impaired muscle power motion. 5th is limb deficiencies. Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm reading wrong. The 5 is limb deficiency. I'm sorry, we're okay. Let me start again, so before I get confused. The 3 is coordination. The 4 is upper limb, lower limb deficiencies. The 5 is impaired muscle power and range of motion. The 5 is the 6 is limb deficiencies with prosthetics. And we'll go over that a little bit later in the next slides. And the last number is the degree that type of athlete has in that class. Typically, the lower the number, the more impaired the athlete is, and the higher the number, the less impaired that athlete is. Next page. Okay, so the visually impaired are T11, 12, and 13, either a T or an F. An 11 is totally blind, a 12 has limited vision, and a 13 has moderate vision. The 11, the totally blind athlete, must have a guide. The 12 may use a guide or may not use a guide, depends on the level. And the 13 is typically someone you see walking the streets with a cane without any guide, and they follow all regular ambulatory rules for track and field. The 20s are intellectually impaired. They have to be classed as an intellectually impaired athlete before they reach the age of 18. They have a IQ of less than 75 or less, and they have to be certified by a bunch of tests before they are approved as an intellectually impaired athlete. The 30 classes are commonly referred to as cerebral palsy, but they also include those athletes that have neurological issues. So if you had somebody that was returning from the war zone and they had a head injury, typically they would be included in this class. But unfortunately, most of our military that are coming back from those areas are over the age of 18 and therefore would not qualify in this category. So for those athletes, usually there are other impairments that do qualify, and so they would be grouped under that other disability. So in that 30 class, the 31s and the 32s are pretty severely handicapped and use a tool called a frame runner, which you'll see in the picture to the right. It's like a bicycle, but they push it. The 33s and 34 are seated athletes, and they use a racing wheelchair. And the 35s through 38s are ambulatory athletes, and they run without assistance. Next page. Right, and Denise wrote that they have to be diagnosed, and I said that before the age of 18, they have to be classed. The 40 class are athletes of short stature, and I always think this is funny, I'm sorry, but the 40s are short stature athletes, and the 41s are taller, so short stature athletes. And we have a 5-time Paralympian, Scott Danberg, who unfortunately, when they redid these rules, became too tall to compete as a short stature person.
Yeah, really.
So, so we kid
Seriously.
him all the time. Next page, please. Okay, so then we get to the 40s class. So if you were if you were certified in the last quad, we only had one class here. We only had one class here for the 42 through 44s and the 61 through 64s. We had grouped both groups, those with lower limb deficiencies without amputation and those lower limb deficiencies with amputation. We grouped them all in that 40 class. After, I think it was 2016, Jerry,
Yeah, I believe so.
they split those two up into two separate groups, which is much more fairer to those athletes to compete. So you can read here how those athletes are divided: single or double through the knee, above the knee, double below the knee, single below the knee. Those are broken up that way. Some of these athletes, those classes 40 through 244 and 61 through 4 are ambulatory. However, some have difficulty doing field in a standing position. So they are also given a different field class. And those field classes listed at the bottom of this page are F57. So, and we'll talk about the 50s class later when we get to seated, but it just lets you know that both some of the 30 class, the 35 through 38s, and some of the 61 through 64s and 42 through 44s are put into this class because they'd prefer, in some cases, or must compete in field seated rather than standing. Okay.
Yeah, they have trunk and upper limbs. It's just their lower limbs typically are not working well and they can't stand up and throw. So we make them a high level seated thrower.
Okay, next page. Okay, so then the other athletes in the 40 classes are 45s through 47. These are athletes who have upper impairments and who compete with or without upper limb prosthetics. And they are bilateral above and below the knee, below the elbow, or down lower towards the wrist. If you look at the events that these athletes will compete in track particularly, you will see that they are the shorter races and they are not allowed to do races in some cases above the 400 meters. And that is because once you get to those distances, their impairment is no different. They can compete just as well as a regular ambulatory USATF athlete. Okay, next. Okay, so now we come to the 50s class. The 50s class is typically a spinal cord injury athlete. Impaired muscle power or leg length difference, spinal cord injury, or spina bifida is typically the case. And they are T51 through 54 or F51 through 57. We have more classes in field than we do in track because it became, it would be unfair to just have 4 classes for these athletes in field. So we have 6 classes. The 51 through 54s, the 51 and the 52 are quads, which means that they have all 4 of their extremities affected, arms and legs. The 53s and 54s have from the top of their stomach down through their legs, they have issues. So a 53 would be a person that has no lower abs, but might have some upper abs. And a 54 would be you or I in a wheelchair. And the only thing that would be different is we weren't using that part of our bodies. Okay, next slide. So to group these athletes, then you can see that track is classes 31 through 34, 51 through 54, and throwing is 31 through 57. And then ambulatory athletes are the blind, the intellectually impaired, the 35, 36, 37, and 8 of the neurological athletes, the short stature athletes, the lower limb athletes, and the amputees. And then we mentioned before that some of the athletes who are standing for track may be seated for field. And so the 35 class would be given a F34 for field if they were to do it seated, and the 42 through 44 and the 61 through 54, 64 would be given a 57 class. Again, for us as officials, we don't need to know everything there is to know about classes. However, when we get to the rules, some of these classes have different exceptions than others. And specifically, when you get to field, the implement weights are going to change depending upon what class they are. Next page. So age group divisions. US Paralympics and World Para Athletics control the two youth classes, U17s and U20s, and the open class, which is 14 as of age 14 as of December 31st through whatever age you want to compete in that open class, and then a Masters 35 division. Next page. ATFUSA, Adaptive Track and Field USA, we control the rules and the standards for U11 athletes. We do have a U7 class, which we call the futures, but we do not invite those athletes to junior nationals. So for the most part, anyone that is U11 or below is in that class. And then we have a U14. And then we have created a special U23 class. It seemed that when particularly the men get out of high school, it takes a much longer time for them to develop to compete with the open athletes in World Para Athletics. And we were losing an awful lot of them, and they were giving it up and not competing anymore. And to keep them in the game until they develop muscularly and develop mentally to compete at that level, we created a U23 class in the junior category. And then we have 3 masters categories, M35, M50, and M60. So we do it that way. So the youth classes, U11, 14, and 23, you have to be that age by December 31st of the year of competition. The masters, as they do in USATF, it's the age of the day of competition. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about track. Okay, so we're going to talk about some general rules. Some of these are USATF just general rules, and so that they are no different. Others have slightly different, so we'll go through them very quickly. If it is true now of USATF as well as for World Para Athletics that if a protest is given, the referee may evaluate video that has been given to them after the event is done and the protest is given. So that's something that you need to know. Relays, there is a difference in relays. So we've all gone now to the expanded tag zone, and that tag zone for ambulatory athletes is from the beginning of the old approach to the actual tag zone, and that area is now 30 meters. That is true for ambulatory relays. For wheelchair relays, we've extended that another 10 meters. So for a wheelchair only relay or a segment of a relay that has a wheelchair in it, that tag area is now 40 meters. Go ahead, Jared. Okay. So let me just put this out there for you. If an athlete has an aid, that aid, we're talking about a 50,000 foot level here. If an athlete has an aid, that aid is the athlete. So, and it doesn't matter whether that aid is a human or a device. So if an athlete uses a racing wheelchair, that racing wheelchair, once he's in it, is the athlete. If he uses a frame runner, the same exists. If he's a visually impaired athlete and he's running with a guide, then the guide is the athlete. So any rules that apply to the athlete in a regular running event or throwing event applies to the athlete with the aid. Okay, so if we're in a curve and a racing wheelchair, any part of the racing wheelchair hits the inside line, they are making the course shorter, and that constitutes a foul and a disqualification. In para athletics, it's the first time they do that. So it's not like in some cases, some of the state high school associations have put in, you know, 1 or 2 touches on the line will excuse you. In this case, it is the first time you touch the line, it is a violation. You should be DQ'd. I'll make one exception to that. We have, if you are unfortunate enough to try to run a track meet on an older track, and that older track has lanes that are less than, 2.5 feet wide, I've sometimes had a good heart because it's just, in some cases, too hard for that wheelchair to stay in the lane. However, you can always go out like an able-bodied runner, and you should not cut the course short. Okay, you are responsible. We do not, let me just make this, we do not in para athletics raise, we do record, the umpire should record the issue. If they think there's an infraction, then they should report it to the referee or the head umpire and let it be resolved at another level. Your job is not to question what they're doing wrong, or if some exclusion exists because of their classification. If you observe it, call it. Okay, so maximum allowable standing height, which is a MASH. If those of you who are clerks and you run the call room, this will be your responsibility. A double amputee, T61s and 64s, obviously are 62. Short. 62, yes, are obviously are short until they put on their prosthetics. However, the prosthetics should never make them be taller than they would have been if they had the rest of their lower extremities. So we have this MASH number, which when the athlete goes through classification, they are given, which basically says that this athlete should be no taller than 5'10". So if they come into the call room and you measure them and they are 5'10" and a quarter, then they, unless they change their prosthetics, they are not allowed to compete in that race. We do not issue MASH numbers to U11 athletes. So we're only talking about U17, 20, and open and master athletes. So that's the way it goes. And we are going to have sometime later in the year a webinar on the call room. So we'll explain it in great detail on how you do your MASH numbers. You do need some equipment to do the MASH number properly, because typically a running leg goes behind the person by 3 or 4 inches, and therefore If you just put them up against the wall, they're going to be leaning backwards and not standing straight up. So we have specific devices that we use to measure MASH. Okay, so everybody get that clue. We do have the clerks shall record the measured height of the MASH on the MASH measurement form, and that MASH measurement form is located on our website as well as the USOPC's website. Next slide. Okay, so for relays, either you're going to use a baton or you're going to touch transition athlete to athlete by a touch. The batons are used for athletes that are blind, visually impaired, are intellectually impaired, or are T35s through 38s. The touch is issued by wheelchair athletes, obviously, who can't push and carry a baton at the same time, as well as amputees. And we include the amputees, obviously, because you might have a 45, 46, or 47 athlete in that group, and therefore it would be difficult to do that, okay? Then for the relays itself, we have the only approved at this time World Para Athletic relay is called the universal relay. And it's basically made up of 2 men and 2 women. The running order is, the first leg is visually impaired. The second leg is 42s through 47s or 51s, 61 through 64s. The third leg are 35s through 38s. And the fourth legs are wheelchairs, 33, 34, 51 through 54. A maximum of 2 athletes can be selected from the following classes: T13, 46, 47, T38, or 54. That's so that you don't overload your relay with the higher level classes and therefore become unfair. And the remaining can be from the rest of the classes. The first 2 ambulatory exchange zones are 30 meters. And the third takeoff zone is the wheelchair takeoff zone, so it has to be 40 meters. Okay, that's a very important question. I think it's on the text. Visually impaired wheelchair and universal relays use an expanded start line of 2 lanes. So because we have wheelchairs in that relay, universal relay, as well as a visually impaired, and we don't know whether those visually impaired athletes have a guide or not, we assign 2 lanes to each of the relay teams. 1-2 is the first relay, 3-4 is the second, 5-6 is the third, and 7-8 is the fourth. We'll cover that later and in another slide. Exchange done with this relay is all by touch. And as you know from USATF, it's not the location of the athletes or the guides. It's the location of the touch, which generates whether that pass was correct or not. Incoming athletes cannot push outgoing athletes, and I don't know what the last. And for VI athletes, the athlete or the guide can make the touch. And in a visually impaired only relay, the athlete or the guide or both, can switch, can carry the baton. Next slide. Okay, just general comments. Mixed events between male and female participants are not normally permitted. In field events and races of 3,000 meters in the US or 5,000 meters or greater for the rest of the world, males and females can be put together. And for mixed field events, you can mix genders, but you will produce results, obviously, by gender. Mixed track competitions shall only be conducted where there are are insufficient athletes. So it isn't a hard and cast rule here, but for the most part, I would be very infrequently would I ever mix male and female events in events below 3,000 meters. Next. Oh, and let me just add this thing. In the United States, because we may not have a whole heat worth of a specific age group and class, we typically would group together either different age groups of the same class or different classes in the same age group. However, if it's an out of lane race, you have to make sure if that happens that any athlete is not going to draft out of their class. We typically do that when we do that by putting little dots on the back of the wheelchairs or on the back of the bibs so that athletes know that they're only allowed to go behind green dots or red dots. But we just, the reason for that is we just don't want a national record to be set because an athlete is pacing or being helped by a athlete in another class with maybe higher abilities. Next slide. Clothing is clothing. The main issue here is that when Jerry gets the field, it's very important that we know whether somebody lifts or not, and Jerry will explain that in great detail. You have the responsibility of the judge, or you have the ability of the judge to tell an athlete to fix their clothing so that you can see what is going on about lifting. Shoes are shoes. They're judged in the call room. Same rules apply to from World Athletics down to World Para Athletics, and to USATF. So the same millimeter spikes, the same number of spikes in a shoe, same rules about that the number of spike holes can't be greater than the legal number of spikes. All those same rules that we just took in our USATF refresher course and test at the beginning of the year apply to the para athletics. Next.
And Phil, that last one about the soles, we're now measuring soles. That's a new IAAF World Athletics rule.
Okay. Okay, bib numbers. Ambulatory athletes on the front and the back. Wheelchair athletes can be, are typically on the back of the chair or the throwing frame. And one is on the lateral side of the frame towards the finish line camera, so that when the camera shines on the racing wheelchair, they can see the bib number on the side of the chair. In addition to this, they're going to be wearing hip numbers, the same as ambulatory athletes do. For wheelchairs, we'll place those hip numbers on their helmet, again, on the camera side. Prosthetics, for track, and a athlete that wears a prosthesis has to use it for track. For jumps, they can use it or they may choose not to use it. But if they use it in field, then they have to finish in jumps. If they have a prosthetic on in the beginning of a jump event, they have to finish the event with the prosthetic. Okay. In field, the prosthetics are optional. 45 through 47 may or may not have the use of a prosthetic, and they have the option of using it or not using it. And 61 and 62s, we talked about this before, the prosthetic must not let the athlete exceed their mash height. Okay. 42s, 43 to 44 athletes with lower limb impairments may use a orthotic device optionally. So they might need something to brace and support their ankles. That's perfectly legal, but it does go through the call room to make sure that everything is correct. Next slide. Okay, eye mask. So the T11 athletes need to be totally blind. In order to be totally blind, we used to require them to wear eye masks or opaque glasses. We found out in 2016 in Rio that there were totally blind athletes that were reading in the athletic area, and even one riding a bicycle. So it became important that that the World Paralympics do something other than a mask or opaque glasses. So we've added gauze patches. So you need to put a gauze patch on the eye itself, and then on top of that, which would then guarantee that the eye that you can't see out of the eyes. What typically would happen before is that if they had even 11s have gradients of athletes who are 11s. Some may have some type of vision as an 11 versus another. So we want to make sure that they're totally blind. And some athletes, before we put the gauze patches on, would actually, during the race, their mask may move a little bit. So they had the ability to see and maybe to stay in their lane better than another athlete. So we ask them now to wear gauze patches as well as the mask.
And it's even without an eye.
Yes, even without an eye. Before, you should be able to tell them that, that they have artificial eyes and they would allow it to go. But now we have to do that. The rule is that you must have the gauze patches as well as the eye mask and opaque glasses on when you leave the call room. And for track, they can't come off until they leave the venue. In field, they're allowed, they come out wearing both, and they must wear them while they're competing. But while they're sitting waiting for their next trial, they are allowed to take the mask or the opaque glasses off, but they must keep the gauze patches in. Okay, helmets. All wheelchair athletes, no matter what the race, have to be wearing approved safety, approved helmets. I don't think this is a problem anymore. Back in the early days, maybe 8 years ago, there were, at the very beginning of bicycle racing, there were those very aerodynamic helmets, but they were not safety certified. And so you must have a helmet that is actually going to protect your head in case you crash. Those helmets must be worn on the track even during warm-ups. And for junior events, they have to be worn from the time they enter the venue until the time that they leave the venue. Because I will guarantee you, every junior athlete from one time or another has fallen backwards and hit their head. It's just a part of the passage of learning how to use a racing wheelchair. Next slide. Okay, so the 11s, we said that the 11s and possibly the 12s can use a guide. So how do you connect the guide to the athlete? You attach the guide to the athlete with a tether. And this has been an evolving tool over the years and has changed. The most current version of the rule says that you have to use a tether that is on the track that is 30 centimeters, not to exceed 30 centimeters long, have a 10 centimeter center span with 2 notches, and then 2 rings on the end that you hold on to or put your arm through to hold the athlete to the guide. And that overall length can't be any more than 30 centimeters. For roads, the tether is expanded to 50 centimeters. Okay, you can't shorten the effective length of the tether on the test, boys and girls. So the athlete and the guide must hold the tether by the loop areas or put their hands through the loop area if they don't have hands that operate. So, right, exactly right. They can't shorten it by grabbing those fixed stoppers, or somewhere in between. Okay. Okie dokie, pokey. Next one.
There you go.
Okay, assistants. These assistant rules are pretty much the same as USATF. Only the official and medical staff appointed by the LOC can treat a competitor in the competition area. Such treatment must not delay the competition. If you're at a regional meet and you're helping out, there is some variance in this rule depending upon who's there and who's in charge of that meet, and the medical staff or the support staff that are there. But for the most part, if you get to a high level meet, it's only the medical staff that are allowed to treat an athlete in the competition area. And again, if they got a cramp or something and they were working on it, but that effective treatment can't delay the event to the extent that it would throw the program off. Possession or the use of video recorders and CDs or any device that transmits information from inside the venue to outside the venue is not allowed. So on a racing wheelchair, you are allowed to have a cat eye on your racing wheelchair that tells the athlete how fast they're going or the cadence that they're going. But you can't have the super duper ones that cost $1 gazillion that would actually transmit that information to a coach outside the venue. So, nor can you have one of those devices, and even though you're not communicating to the coach, you can't, it can't communicate at all. Provision of advice of support staff or officials. This is really a, I feel sorry for the para athlete statement. Don't feel sorry for a para athlete. They've worked just as hard as our ambulatory USATF athletes. They are good people. They are people who make mistakes, and it's not our responsibility as officials to help them or to coach them or to support them. Other than to do our normal job as an official. You can't treat one athlete different than you can treat another athlete. I know I'm preaching to the choir because this is standard with USATF. However, what we found is I feel sorry for that little kid there without legs. Well, don't feel sorry for him. He's very happy and that he's competing and he's being treated like everyone else. Okay, so ambulatory athletes who are competing from a standing position are not allowed to use a wheelchair to access the field of play. So this really is an issue that if you declare yourself as an ambulatory athlete and you're going out to the field to play, or if you were doing a pentathlon and you were moving from event to event, you can't have an advantage by hopping in a wheelchair and saving your legs for the next event, right? So, I mean, that's where that rule really has its spirit from. So, in other words, if you declare yourself as an ambulatory athlete, then it's your responsibility to physically walk from venue to venue.
Bill,
yes.
You also cannot use it, say throws and lean against the wheelchair to throw.
Right. You can't use that as an aid.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Ambulatory athletes are competing from a standing position are not allowed. Oh, this is what you just said, Jerry, right? Any device on a racing wheelchair that could communicate to anyone else is not allowed. We talked about that. And okay, so we have the ability for certain classes to have an aid. I'll give you an example. A intellectually impaired athlete may need an aid to help them get into their blocks to start a race. A T13 may need an aid in a relay to position them correctly in their takeoff zone. Those are aids. Sometimes those aids are the role of the aid is being played by their coach. When those people are given the role of aid, they cannot coach. Happens all the time. And they don't even know typically that they're doing it, but obviously some who are very good know exactly what they're doing. So in order to be fair, you cannot, when you're acting as an aid, you have to be an aid. You can talk about the weather, you can talk about put your left leg here, but you can't say, you really should push harder in the second section of the 400 meters. And it happens all the time. Okay. Okay, next slide.
No.
Okay, but what's not considered a communication between the athlete and the coaches, not in the competition area, same as ambulatory, right? So if we're doing a field event and that athlete has a coach in the stands, that coach can yell and scream to that person. That athlete can walk across the track and talk to that coach. Absolutely, no problem at all. Treatments that do not delay the competition, perfectly okay if you have an athlete. If a coach takes a video of an athlete doing field and then the athlete walks over to the coach and that video is shown to the athlete, perfectly legal, no problem at all.
However, if that coach leans over the wall with that video device to show the athlete, that's not allowed.
Okay. All right, next slide. All right, so next 10 or 15 minutes, we'll get through the rest of the track. So let's talk about each of the impairments and talk about the specific rules that affect them in track. So the T11 through 13s must use blocks, number one rule. There is a youth exception, just as we have in USATF, that the U14 athletes may opt not to use blocks, but it is a rule for the 11 through 13. So if you're a call room person taking the athletes out to the track, you have to make sure that the blocks are available for them. If you're a starter, you shouldn't start the race if you have T11s through 13s and they are not using blocks. If you're dealing with an 11 or a 12 that have a guide, both athlete and the guide must use the blocks. You can't decide that that the guide is not using the blocks and the athlete is. The 11 athletes are required, as we talked about before, to wear to be completely covered. The 11s must use the guide and they use 2 lanes to compete. The 12s may use a guide, but from a heating and seating point of view, we always heat and seed with 2 lanes. So you don't know prior to the meet when you're trying to set up a heating and seating, whether or not that 12 is going to have a guide or not. So you always allocate them 2 lanes. And they must have 2 lanes. They can use either lane. They can use the left-hand side of the lane or the right-hand side of the lane, but it is their lane. And the lanes are defined as lane 1, which is lane 1 and 2. 3 is 3 and 4. 5 is 5 and 6, and 7 is 7 and 8. When I first started running races with the visually impaired, one of my first races, I had a T11 athlete who was going to run in the 1-2 pair, and the athlete was going to run in 2. So when they came to the starting line, they moved up from the 1 starting line to the 2 starting line. And I said, why are you here? Why aren't you back at the lane 1 starting line? And he says, well, my athlete is running in lane 2, and I only want him to run this 400 meters, not 406 meters. And I said, unfortunately, that is not the case, that the athlete has the choice of running in each lane, but the lanes are defined as 1, 3, 5, and 7. That's a good question to know, because there's a test question on that. Okay, the 13s have no guide. So so they're looking like any of our ambulatory athletes that we know of. Okay, let me just see. Jerry, can you run this? Can you run this this video? No, back it up.
Oh, the video? Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, just
it's
go down to
it links to the internet.
Yeah, go to the bottom. No. I'm sorry, go to the bottom of that. It should open, shouldn't it?
No, it doesn't.
Okay, then don't worry about it. Let's move on.
Whoops.
If you were to go to the, I'm sorry to screw you up like this. If you're interested in seeing those type of the visually impaired running with guides, I really strongly suggest that you open up the Zoom call that we ran on video athletes. And
Yeah, for sure. You know, Phil, one point with that picture, you can see how close their hands are.
Yeah.
The reason why the new tether was invented was because it was too easy for the guide to take total control over how the athlete used their arms. And it was perceived to be somewhat of a pulling effort, which is of course not legal. So this is an old tether. You can see how close their hands are. So that's why when you use this other tether, the loops, you can't roll them over your hand and get your hands really close together. That's why this 10-centimeter space in there is for a gap between the arms of the 2 athletes.
Good catch. And Dr. Darla, they can run in either lane. So and they can move from, well, I don't know how you would, if they had a guide, I don't know how you would switch lanes because you have the tether.
It'd be kind of tough, wouldn't it?
But but a 12 who does not have a guide can move from lane 1 to lane 2 and back to lane 1. As long as they stay within those 2 lanes, that's perfectly legal. The next slide.
Whoops.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry about that.
Am I here? Where am I?
There we go.
Okay. The okay, we talked a lot about the lane, so I'm not going to talk about that anymore. We talked about most of this. They have to be connected. They have to be holding the outside of the tether. If the tether, again, let's talk about this. If any device, and that means the guide, the tether, if anything goes wrong, that is the athlete. And if the tether breaks, the athlete is disqualified. Okay, they can't, and that's I think that's a question on the test also. So you want to make sure that, so if when they're racing with the tether, and the tether breaks, they have to stop running.
Yeah, basically, if they become disconnected at any time during the event, they're disqualified.
Right, because when the guide and the athlete are connected with the tether, they're one thing, and when the tether breaks, they're no longer one thing. The guide can't push, pull, or propel the athlete. So you'll see, if you do look at the VI's presentation, you'll see where a guide, in some cases, will pull the athlete because they're running too slow, or push the athlete to get them to propel a little bit, go further. At the end of the race, the athlete must cross the finish line before the guide, and the guide must be connected to the athlete through the tether through the whole race. including all the way through the finish line. Okay, and the last point here is that in a 5,000 meter or longer event, the T11 or T12 athlete may have two guides to run. They have to declare before the race starts that they're going to use the two guides. The guide that's going to be the second guide will be placed on the opposite side of the track from the start finish line. And they typically would have to declare when during that event they are going to make that transition. If they start to make that transition and they fail to make that transition, or and that's happened in the past where the guide will go into and the other guide will say, I'm doing fine, don't take over. Then that athlete pair is disqualified because they didn't use the guide. So if they declare it, they have to use it. And they have to do, and typically they declare when during the race they're going to make that switch so that we as officials can observe that happening. Okay, next slide. So here's an example of the slides of the athletes in their 1, 3, 5, and 7. Okay, if you were setting up the track, you basically just take tape of a similar color as the lane lines and extend it across to the second lane. Okay, and in a relay, you would extend the line at the start and the finish of the tag zone. Okay, next slide. Okay, we talked about this. VIs must use batons. They can be passed between the guide or the athlete can do that. Not position, the position of the baton, not the position of the athlete or the guides, will determine whether the takeover or the exchange pass was legal or not. For a VI only relay, we talked about the universal relay, but if you ran a VI only relay, which again is not an international event for this quad, but we may run it in the United States from time to time, a minimum of 1 class 11 and no more than 1 class 13 is allowed in the 4. Okay, next slide. Okay, intellectually impaired. Intellectually impaired athletes must use a baton in a relay run, and they must use blocks. And the same rule applies for U14 athletes. They can opt not to use those blocks. If an athlete, on the right-hand side of the screen, you see a request for assistance in competition. Typically, these athletes may have a problem setting the blocks up themselves. So there is a request for assistance competition form. In a large meet, you'd typically fill that out. In a small meet, you would request in the call room to go out on the track or have one of the officials go out on the track and set the blocks for the athlete. Okay, these athletes may have a difficulty in understanding. So starters should be aware that they have T20s at the starting line, and they should, make sure that they convey the start commands in a orderly and calm process. Next slide. 31s through 38s. Again, we talked about this. There's 3 different groups in this. The 31s and 32s, pretty severely handicapped. They typically have hand issues as well as leg issues. These people are very smart. I think you should sit down with a person in this class sometime. Their minds are unbelievably, they're just as intelligent as any most normal ambulatory people, if not smarter. But they have major issues with their brain conveying the information to their muscles in order to perform. So don't maybe this is a call to the choir here, but don't think somebody is something until you actually have an opportunity to talk to them, because they're wonderful, intelligent people. So they are, the 31s and 32s typically have hand as well as leg issues and really can't control themselves that much. So we use that frame runner in order to race. Those frame runners use 2 lanes to do that. The 33s and 34s are athletes that have the same conditions but are less or more able and use a racing wheelchair in 1 lane. And the ambulatory athletes are T35 through 38. Doesn't translate. This is the only class that it really doesn't translate that a 35 is less handicapped than a 38. It really is different types of disabilities that affect these classes. They don't.
Hemiplegic too.
Yeah, they don't.
55.
I'm sorry, what'd you say, Jerry?
No, it's okay.
Okay, they're not required to use blocks. The athletes can crouch stand or do a 3-point stand with or without blocks. Just a comment about blocks. In all cases, we're not requiring our athletes to use 2 blocks. An athlete can use only 1 of the blocks, but then if they're required to use blocks, they have to use a block or both blocks in the pair. Okay. The relays are done by baton or if they're in a wheelchair, by touch. Now, a key message here for starters. You know, when we have an issue with ambulatory athletes and they're getting rambunctious, we tell them all to stand up and we go back into the process again. Be very careful with this class of athlete. Typically, when things start to go wrong, they only get worse because this is happening. So wherever possible, get them to get on your marks, get set, and bang as quickly as you can. And it may be very difficult to pick up a total still position, but do the best you can with this class. But again, I would strongly recommend that unless it's really severe, don't make them stand up and bring them back down again, because typically the next time you go through it, it possibly will be worse. This is when they changed the rule, they came up with that rule that, if you false start, you are disqualified. This is probably one of the few classes where an athlete may seem to false start, but because of their disability, it's actually not giving them a performance improvement. So if you see something, then make sure that it was truly a false start versus just a medical issue. Next slide. All right, 42 through 44, 61 through 64s. Obviously, the top slide is 61 through 64s, and the bottom slides are 35 through 38s. Look pretty normal, right? Pretty normal. A double amputee really is very unstable. So again, they have issues. They're not required to use blocks. They can crouch, stand, or use a 3-point stance. If a double amputee is going to use blocks, they will typically need an aide or someone to help them set that blocks up, because they physically can't lean over and do that themselves. So,
especially above the knee.
Yeah, be aware of that. Be aware of that. If a track, in track, horizontal jumps, and road events, the athletes must compete again and finish with the prosthetic. Okay, here's an issue on the test. In the old quad, the rule said that a amputee must finish with the prosthetic and can't hop. Hopping meaning, if they lost the prosthetic, they would hop to the finish with their good leg, okay? That rule has changed for this quad. The rule now is if they start the race with a prosthetic, they must end the race with the prosthetic, but they don't have to have it on. They can carry it across the line. The change came about because if a amputee loses their prosthetic, they're typically going to lose the race anyway. And it may take an extraordinary amount of time for them to put that prosthetic on, if they can put it on at all. So,
Or it broke.
Or it broke. Yeah, I was just going to say that. Or it broke so that it can't put it back on. So the rule has been amended. Hopping has been taken out of the rule. And the only rule now says that you must finish with the prosthetic on. Again, that is on the test. We tried to build a test on the things that all of us on the Paris committee have noticed over the last quad to be the most difficult things that are between ambulatory and para track and field. So these are, in some cases, they're not easy questions, but they are, I think, a good set of 25 questions. Okay, all exchanges for these athletes are done by touch, not by baton. Next slide. Okay, those athletes 45 through 47 obviously have something wrong with their arms. Look at the slide to the right. If you have something wrong with your arm and you're trying to get into a starting position, you may not be able to get in a starting position if one arm is totally okay, but the other arm, maybe you're an amputee above the elbow or below the elbow. We have allowed them to use these pads at the start. The only rule that we have is that the best practice is that they have to have a neutral color and they have to be in compliance by being non-partisan, non-political. So I had our junior team go over to Ireland a few years ago. I had the athlete in Chicago at the Glassa meet, and she was on the starting line, and her pads were decorated in red, white, and blue for America. Very, very patriotic. I said to her, you need to make these neutral colors because you can't use this in Ireland when you go to Ireland. Well, I was in Ireland and she went to the starting line with her red, white, and blue. And guess what? She couldn't use it. So just note, I wouldn't end or unless it's really a political or obscene issue. I wouldn't prevent them from running in a domestic, regional or community event, but please tell them that they have to change that. Those aids are the athlete. Again, anything is the athlete. So if an athlete has to be totally beyond the line, so does this aid have to be totally beyond the line. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we have wheelchairs. So a racing wheelchair doesn't have a maximum length. It does have 3 wheels. The rear wheels are 700, can have a maximum height of a 700-seat tire, and the front wheel has a maximum height of 50 centimeters. It can't have any gears, mirrors, fairlings that would allow it to be more aerodynamic. It can't have a braking, it has to have steering and a braking system. We don't usually use the braking system, but it is required, especially when you're doing road races, and you don't use the typical left and right steering mechanism in a racing wheelchair on the track. The racing wheelchair has something called a compensator. Jerry, it's pictured at the bottom of the screen. That compensator is a piston, and when you hit it one way, it sets the front wheel for the curve, and then when you hit it the other way, it sets the front wheel for the straight. And they set that up during warm-ups. From a meet management perspective, or officials, if you're running a USATF event and there's a racing wheelchair, your wheelchair competitor may ask you, is there some time prior to my race that I can set my compensator? That's what they're going to do. They're just going to go around the track 1 or 2 times and set that compensator for the curve on that particular track. Tracks, as you know, do change. The angles of those tracks in the curves change, and they need to be set. Typically in a para meet, we would, and there's been an exceptional amount of time maybe for between races, we may allow those racers to come up to the start line and then release them for 1 lap to come back to the start line, in which they can set those compensators up. Okay, next slide.
Yeah. So we should note that in the call room, all these things get checked, and the brake and the steering device must be functional. They can't be just for show.
Yeah, correct. I'm sorry. And if you have a wall in your call room, the typical way to check if the back of the chair conforms to the rules is that you push the chair up against the wall, and the tire should hit the wall and not the seating frame that is supported by those rear wheels. So that's a quick way of understanding that. And then we typically at a para meet have yardsticks that we've marked at 70 centimeters and 50 centimeters so that we can quickly walk around and check those devices. You can at the starting line check them again, but typically racing wheelchairs, once they're set, they're set. Next slide. Okay, wearing a helmet is a rule. Gloves are not a rule, but all racing wheelchair athletes wear gloves, and there is no style or particular version of the rules. Very beginning athletes, we give them baseball gloves and we tape them up so that they can use that. More experienced athletes will use leather gloves. The ones on the left at the bottom are called oh gosh, I remember.
Harness?
Yeah, they're, and the ones at the right are made from 3D printers. The ones on the right are very hard, and they act better for the elite racer because you can put more force into the wheel with less cushioning. So that's, and we talked about hip numbers. Hip numbers go on the helmet. Next.
Hey, Phil, one point you were talking in the previous slide about gears.
Yeah.
You can't have more than 1 push whim on the wheel, which would be effectively having a gear.
Okay. Oh, yes. Okay. I've never seen that. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
Well, that's pretty cool. Obviously, you know, if you have a big push rim and a little push rim, the big push rim gives you better at once you got up to speed, but the smaller push rim would give you more initial torque into the wheel. And so I know that if you're a sprinter, you might tend to use the smaller push rim, and if you're a distance racer, you typically are going to use the larger push rims. Next slide. Okay, so the pictures on the right are old. That's before we had a helmet rule, but we haven't found a picture to replace this one yet. But so the start position for frame runners and for wheelchairs are that the bottom of the front wheel has to be behind the start line. So next month we're gonna have a starters webinar, and we have slides in there for the starter to show you a correct position and an incorrect position for that front hub, the front wheel. This goes to the next slide, but the finish of a race is the axle of the front wheel. So it's not the front of the front wheel, but it's the actual axle of that front wheel. When you line up on that start line and you position the bottom of the wheel behind the start line, the hub, the axle will be slightly behind where an ambulatory athlete would actually be able to put their body, but that is the rule. It isn't the position of the axle at the start line. It's that bottom of the front wheel where it touches the ground must be behind the line. And then depending upon the age and the ability of the athletes, you may have athletes that move to the start line and are actually in the start line position before you say on your marks. And then the more experienced athletes will be like the traditional ambulatory athletes behind the line and will come up to the line when you say on your marks. They typically will set up faster than ambulatory athletes with blocks. So they typically take a fraction of the time once they come up to that line to move into the set position, and then you either for the shorter races, then you run your gun. The 33s and 34s, as we talked about for that class, that whole class of athletes have issues controlling their mind, and their muscle control is very different. So it's not advantageous to hold a 33, 34 athlete field at that start line. You should get on your mark, set, and fire the gun as quickly and as properly as possible, but not delay that start.
It is kind of disconcerting at the start line the first time you see it, when half the wheel of the racing chair is on the other side of the starting line.
Right. But always go back in your mind that the actual start and finish of the race is really that axle and not the front of the wheel. And then it sort of all makes sense. Next slide. So in a racing wheelchair or a frame runner race, you're going to have athletes that are going to overtake other athletes. And in order to do that, you need to follow the slides that are on the slide pictures that are on the left. So you must have a position of the front wheel at or in front of the rear axle. And then that athlete on the inside cannot cut off the athlete that's overtaking them. He's got position on him, and you must guarantee that that athlete passes the other athlete. Next slide. Oh, and the last thing is that a starter can recall an 800-meter race in the first 50 meters if there's a crash. Go ahead. And we have great crashes. And typically no one gets hurt. In the 800 meters, we have the brake line. All para races are run, 800-meter races are run in lane until the brake line, whether you're ambulatory or wheelchair. The rule for the wheelchair doesn't make sense, but it is the rule. It is not that start finish position of the front axle. It is the rear wheel axle that must cross the brake line in order to be a good, in order for you to move in. And we changed, and there's a little difference between the, in an able-bodied race, we would put small cones between the lane lines. Here, we use that, you would use this tape and tape it like that behind the line. Next slide. I'm running late, so I'm going to go a little faster here. All right, and we talked about this. It's the hub. It's actually it used to be the hub of the front wheel until my daughter Jessica Cloy lost the 800 meters in Beijing by 1,000th of a second, and then in 2009 they made it the axle of the front wheel. So, next slide. I'm not going to go through this, but we already talked about this. The exchange zones for these races for the racing wheelchairs are 40 meters and not 30 meters. Next slide. Okay, this is dimensions for a frame runner. Again, you won't have to understand this unless you were the official in the call room. Next slide. And now, Jerry, go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Phil. That was great. Thanks everybody for sticking with us. Yeah. We'll try and get through this as quickly as we can, but give you some good information. You've seen this chart typically before. It's a little bit different for parasport. In seated throws, you can see whether you have 3 or more in the pit, or you have consecutive trials for seated throws. It's 1 minute per throw. For other ambulatory events, it's 1 minute except for consecutive trials. And then this is the typical thing that you're all probably pretty used to. When we do 6 throws in a row, and we do that, and it's kind of up to the LOC and the TD to decide whether that's the case, we can decide to allow the athlete to have 1 minute between throw 3 and 4. They can refuse that if they wish and continue competing, but we offer them, and that's at the discretion of the TD to put that in the information that the coaches and the athletes get at the beginning of the event. There are some other seated throws requirements we're going to talk about. In the high jump, the official that's responsible for running the high jump can and must tell the athlete when the trial will begin. So he or she will typically ask the athlete, are you prepared? And there's some unique requirements about high jump for different disabilities. Once they've discerned that, they will tell the athlete time is running, something to that effect, and the period of 1 minute will proceed. Assistance. We talked a lot about assistance already. Just to repeat here in the jumps, for the most visually impaired athletes, the T11s, they can have 2 assistants in the jumps, but they're only allowed to have 1 for the throwing events. In the throwing events, the assistant will typically escort the athlete, say for the discus, into the cage, bring them to the back of the circle. It doesn't matter how the athlete enters the circle, and then will leave the circle and go out into the sector and act as a caller. And is it up to you as a judge if you think that assistant is in a dangerous position? But he's helping to orient that athlete, especially if they're doing a spin, to determine what is a good release point. For the class T12s, they get one guide for jumps or throws. It doesn't matter. And the T13s are not allowed to have assistants during their performances. And like we said before, the assistants can help orient the athlete on the runway or in the ring. They use sound, voices, clapping. We've even had some people strap on a little amplifier and a microphone and use that to amplify their voice so that the athlete can hear. Typically in the long and triple jump, what will happen, and for the T11s with 2 athletes, 2 assistants, the first assistant will orient the athlete on the runway at the position that they've decided to use for their acceleration. The other assistant will be down near the pit. Typically, it should be between the board and the pit, and they will be clapping their hands, calling. Sometimes they'll stand to the side and just lean their head in and yell that way so that their voice is coming from the center of the runway and still working. As the athlete approaches, they either get out of the way or they'll just stand up so they're not going to interfere with the athlete making their jump. As you know, in long jump and triple jump, the throw is not over until the athlete has stepped on the deck and exited correctly. The assistant may not reach in and touch the athlete and assist them out of the pit. That would be a foul. However, they can stand on the deck adjacent to the pit and call or clap to help orient the athlete as to the correct direction. And that would be the same thing in a throwing pit where the assistant would be back there in the back, calling to them and helping them leave the throwing pit from the back of the circle. Whoops. I'm having trouble controlling this today, sorry. Okay. For T11s and 12s, the board is not your typical board. The board now becomes a 1 meter long area that you can see up here, and there's a little bit more of a close-up. It is filled with powder. It may be sand, it may be talcum powder. There's some other things. It's always nice to have something that if it gets rainy and wet, It doesn't get sticky and gooey, but that can be a problem. So the question becomes, the reason we do this, I should say, is that when the blind athlete comes running down the runway, how does he see where the board is, right? He or she can't see that board. So what they do, they have trained and they know kind of how many strides it is, roughly to where that powdered area 1 meter long is. They plant their foot in the powder, and the measurement is taken from the legal landing point, the first break in the sand, all the way back to the toe of the imprint in the powder. A foul is a foul. If you go over this, the plasticine that's there, if there's plasticine or if it's a taped board, that's going to be a foul, just like normal. The other thing that happens, and it happens somewhat frequently, is the athlete will kind of misjudge their stride a little bit, and they will be counting the stride, and they will jump, but their foot plant will be before they've reached the powder. They land appropriately, and then you ask yourself, to what point do I measure the distance of that jump? Well, what you do is you go only to the back line of the powder, no matter where that foot plant was before it, and you measure to that point. And that's how you determine what the jump that gets recorded is done. 13s don't use powder. They jump as one would typically do as an ambulatory athlete. Let's see. The typical landing area in the pits is 2.75 meters. If you're doing visually impaired athletes, when we do our site reviews, we really like to have a 3.5 meter wide pit, because, and I'll show you a video in a minute, it's really easy for the athlete to get disoriented and run at an angle and jump towards the side of the pit. And if it's really, really narrow, they can land on the edge of that pit and really hurt themselves considerably. So we like to have as wide a pit as we possibly can. We talked about measuring from the footprint, and here's another picture of that. The takeoff boards for long jump, we usually have either a 1 meter or a 3 meter board. And when we're setting up the long jump and we're setting up the heats or the flights, we typically will look at their best effort or their qualifying distances that they submitted in registering for the event. And this will help us determine for in each class of athletes where that board should be. You don't want it too close, because you don't want to have them overstepping and stepping on the edge of the pit. But you also don't want to have it, say, at 3 meters when their jump is typically around 4 meters. And for some athletes, that might be the case. They'll land on the edge of the runway and also injure themselves. So those kinds of considerations are taken as we set up the events. We always consider safety. Junior athletes, the board distance from the pit is determined, and that's how we do it. We understand how long they can jump. Typically, it's a shorter distance, and we will make a new board if we have to, and it won't be a replaceable one. We'll use white tape and tape a board down on the runway. For triples, class 11s, 9 meter minimums. For the 12s and 13s, the minimums are 11 meters. Was somebody asking a question?
Jerry, this is Jesse. You have a question about, in your illustration, it looks as though there's the powdered, board, and then that brighter red would be like the true board. And they're asking, what if their foot is half on both?
The distance will be 1 meter. I've seen instances where they use the normal board and then add powder to extend it to 1 meter. So plasticine doesn't wind up may or may not becoming involved. But the powdered area should be 1 meter long. So we like to see it behind the toe board, and plasticine won't be involved.
Jerry, that whole red area is past the scratch line in this particular example.
Okay, all right.
So the white area, is is made up of the traditional board plus the remaining is filled with powder. That's where the, okay, so.
No, thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, so that's why that top picture, the top foot is considered a
scratch.
foul, just like any ambulatory athlete going into the plastine or over the plastine. Yeah.
Gotcha. Cool.
Okay.
Long jump prosthetics are not required in field events, but if they decide to use their prosthesis, they must continue to use it throughout the entire event. That's kind of a standard in track and in field. Of course, long jump and triple jump are now track events, as you can see by the T. If the prosthetic device is used and it's lost during the run-up, so the athlete starts running down the runway, and for some reason the connection between his remaining limb and the prosthetic limb becomes disconnected and they lose it, we would stop the clock, and the athlete can't continue hopping and running without the prosthesis. They have to put it back on and or adjust it so that they can finish the attempt. If the athlete loses their prosthesis after they take off from the board, in other words, they're flying and the prosthetic limb falls off of their leg, what do we do? Okay, if it lands in the pit and it's the closest mark in the sand, that's the point to which we measure. If it lands outside of the landing area on the deck anywhere, it is automatically a foul. So we don't have to worry about strange different distances before or after the athlete anymore. If it's on the deck, it is a foul. Oops. High jump. High jump is, to me, one of the coolest events to watch for amputee athletes. And I don't know if I have a video in here or not. I don't think so. But if you're using a prosthetic limb and it's lost during the run-up, you can't continue without putting it back on. It's just like before, you have to put that prosthetic device back on your leg and finish the jump. If you're wearing a prosthetic limb and you make your final foot plant and you're flying and the limb falls off of your leg, it must go over the bar as well. If you go over the bar and you clear the bar, but the limb falls on the side from where you planted your foot, that's a foul. So the limb has to go over with you.
It goes back to my first statement when we started this thing.
Yeah.
If you always think of anything that is used as an aid or a person that's used as an aid, that becomes the athlete. And so whatever the rule for the athlete is, it follows with the aid.
Absolutely. Great point, Phil. Whoop. They can need a new computer. Okay, we're going to start looking at secured throws, or as we typically call them, seated throws. There's some requirements in the call room that you need to measure for these field chairs. You can see one of our US athletes, Scott Severn, over here throwing a javelin. There may be a vertical pole. The area around the seat is a certain minimum. The height on top of the cushion without the athlete sitting there is a certain minimum, and we're going to talk about that, as well as rules for judging the event, something called lifting. Those of you who have ever done a seated throws event, you know exactly what we're talking about. It is a tough thing to do, and we're going to try and educate you here. The height of the chair to the top of the cushion without the athlete in the chair cannot exceed 75 centimeters. And it's the athlete's responsibility that that chair meets specification. If it doesn't, when you're checking it in the call room, the athlete does not leave the call room into the competition area. We have, especially at local events, allowed athletes to borrow a chair from another athlete if they can manage to arrange that. We would allow that as long as that other chair met criteria. Sometimes individuals at local meets will use their daily wheelchair to throw. Again, that daily wheelchair can't exceed 75 centimeters. In international competition, some athletes will use a daily chair, or they may use an electric chair, and that chair will be put up on a platform such that the platform will give enough extra height to the chair up to the point where it is 75 centimeters high. I wish I had a picture. I'm going to find one because it's really an interesting looking device. But it's important, 75 centimeters no matter what. And the frame can't be taken from the venue before the start of the event. So other than their day chair.
So typically in a regional event, we would not have a call room for field. We would actually have the athletes go directly to the ring. And then in those cases, you would do call room duties before the athlete competes for their first time.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you, Phil. Here's an example of a chair that's in a call room somewhere. There's other pieces of equipment laying around. You can see that the minimum that you can have a side on a chair, and it must be square or rectangular, it can't be round, is 30 centimeters, which is about a foot. It can be bigger, but it can't be smaller. It's okay if you have a hole in the chair. What this chair does, this particular chair belonged to an amputee. And this is Velcro strapping in a towel. So he'd wrap the towel around his stump, and then this Velcro strapping would keep his leg on the chair. So that's why that's there, and that's perfectly legal. When you measure the chair, you would measure it to the height of the cushion, because this is going around his leg. Sometimes you might misperceive it. It says, well, gosh, I have to measure the top of all this padding. That padding is going to be on top of his leg, his or her leg. You can have back rests or side rests, just like in a regular everyday chair. There are certain requirements. The material used for the back rest or side rest can't be elastic or stretchy. That means it can store energy, and that energy can be released to assist the athlete to make their throws. Also, the padding that is typically found on some of these back rests and side rests can't exceed a depth of 5 centimeters, not including any metal support piece that the padding is attached to. Here's same thing again. The frame can't be round. It has to be, can't be round. It must be square. You can have a vertical, you can have a vertical bar here. For classes F31 and 33 through 33 and F51 through 53, these are the athletes that have more of a functional impairment in those particular classes. This athlete right here, one of our US athletes, you can see he's got tape around it. He's wearing a glove. He's got tape wrapped around it, and he's tied his hand to the vertical pole here. And that is perfectly allowed within the rules because of his class. The reason why we allow that is these athletes don't have very good hand function. Some of them can only spread open their fingers, but they have no ability to grasp, or a very limited ability to grasp and hold on to the pole. So we allow them to do what this athlete does here, and that's perfectly legitimate for only these classes of athletes. That's important to remember. We have a cheat sheet. I'm not sure if it's on our website or not, Phil, but if it isn't, we should probably put it on there. That reminds you which classes can do what in terms of assistance, and which classes can use this particular kind of tying their hand to the pole. Every single athlete that is doing a seated throw may add tape to the pole, but only a minimal amount. And the reason is those poles get slick, especially if it's raining outside. So we allow them to put a little tape on there so they can have something that has texture that they can hold on to the pole with. For the 51s through 53s, like I showed you just before that athlete, Oftentimes what you'll see them do is build up a little bubble of tape on top of the tape, and that allows them to kind of wrap their hand around. It's kind of like a ball, and it forces their hand to go into that shape, and then they can put with their glove on, and then they tape their hand to that. That's perfectly allowed. These vertical bars must be vertical, and they can, when we take a look at it, if you see something that doesn't look quite right, if it's plus or minus 5 degrees, that's perfectly okay. Now we're going to show you a video here in a second, but you can see this angled bar here tied to the vertical bar. It's supporting it. And the rule indicates that this vertical bar cannot bend. You can imagine a big 250-pound guy with his hand up on the pole, throwing himself back. That pole is going to bend. It's going to store a lot of energy. And as he goes forward, that stored energy is going to release and help pull him forward, or she, and assist in that throw. That is illegal assistance. Let me quickly show you this. Okay, watch the video on the left and watch his vertical bar. Takes a second to start. There you go. Okay, you can see as he's comes forward, winding up, throws his body backwards. Watch the bar. Look how much it bends. That's a lot of stored energy. And then he comes forward, that bar assists him to a certain point. His hand came away from his chin, so that's illegal anyway, but he was quite a thrower. Over here is another case. Watch this one. I won't tell you what that really means in English because it wouldn't be appropriate. So watch him, he winds up, and you see how much that bar is moving? It's not really the bar. What it is watch the platform he's tied to. Watch it here. See how much that platform is moving? And he's complaining about the chains not tying his chair down, not tight enough as well. So that would not be a foul. Okay, come back to the other, here we go. And next. Okay. When we do seated throws, there are 3 different things that basically happen. Number 1 is you and your team are responsible for tying the chair down to the platform. You make that chair available to the athlete. The athlete mounts the chair, and then he or she, depending on their class, has a certain amount of time available to do warm-up throws or to strap themselves onto the chair and do as many warm-up throws as they want. And then the third piece is, of course, once they're finished with the throw, they dismount and leave the event area. Class 32s through 34s and 51s through 54s can have an assistant that escorts them, that can escort them out onto the field of play. We typically ask these assistants to stay in separate seats when they're waiting for their turn, but they can assist the athlete in transferring from their everyday chair to the seated throwing chair. Remember, it's 75 centimeters tall. So it's quite a task for some people to make that transfer from their everyday chair up high onto that frame. So we allow them to assist. Cardinal rule, when you're the official, that assistant may not coach them. They may not say anything that would suggest they're reminding the athlete to do this when they're throwing. That's coaching, not allowed. We get a little soft when we're doing that with new athletes that are young. especially U14s. But you know, typically it's something we must remember. Athletes that are class 55 through 57, the more functional of the spinal cord injury athletes, these 32s through 34s would be CP. The 55s through 57s must make that transfer onto their throwing frame by themselves, and they must strap without assistance. However, there is an option for them to file a request paperwork for assistance should they believe they can't do that transfer. Now, it can't be just because I'm a large athlete and I can't make that transfer. However, you can imagine, say, an athlete trying to make a transfer when they've broken one of their arms and it's not their throwing arm. Making that transfer would be actually not a very safe thing to do. The TD and the LOC would make a decision that would allow them to do it, and they would bring this paperwork to the call room and do that. Little more lax on doing this when we're doing regional meets here in the United States or local meets. But when you get to you know, major events that are well controlled, and we must follow the rules. But this does give us some decision-making capability to work with athletes and not injure them further. Chair positioning in the ring. The frame, anything attached to the frame has to be inside the circle, even the foot plates. Nothing can stick out in the air over the inside rim of the circle. However, the athlete's feet or their limbs can stick out in front of the circle in the air. That's perfectly fine, but no part of the chair may stick out beyond beyond essentially the inside of the toe board. We typically use tie downs and straps to secure the frame to the ring. If the athlete touches those holding straps that are tying the chair down during their throw, and that touch takes place outside of that vertical plane of the throwing ring, that is a foul. Sometimes you'll see them, they'll throw forward, extend their arm, make the throw, and they lose their balance, and they'll fall forward, and their hand will slap down and touch, like over here in this picture over here, see these straps? Sometimes these straps are up here, they may fall forward, and their hand will touch the strap outside of the ring. That is a foul. Okay, I mentioned earlier that there are a certain amount of time you have, depending on your class, for tying yourself down onto the chair throwing frame and making as many warm-up throws as you wish. A point here is that if the athlete doesn't want warm-up throws, they're free to say no thank you and continue directly into competition. For the more severely functionally limited athletes, the F31s, the lower end of the CP range, and the F51s through 53s, the lower end of the spinal cord injury-like group, they get 5 minutes to do that. Everybody else gets 4 minutes because they are more functional. They should be able to tie themselves onto the throwing chair and do those warm-ups in less amount of time. It's a little more difficult for these guys to tie themselves down. And remember, some of these guys can have assistants to help them with that task. Another point about the assistants, if the athlete asks, can bring out their water bottle in between throws, or in between that 1 minute time that we sometimes give them between throw 3 and 4. Let's see, what else is in here? If we give the athletes 3 throws and then whittle it down to the final 8 and give them the second 3 throws, there is no warm-up period for the second 3 throws. And the time given for the athlete to tie themselves down and begin throwing is 2 minutes for the more functional of the classes and 3 minutes for the lower functioning classes. And remember, this is to get into the chair, strap themselves down, and be ready to throw. So it's less than you would have if you're doing warm-ups, but we're not doing warm-ups in this particular case. For Adaptive Track and Field USA, the youth under the age of 14, one warm-up is offered if the strap time has expired and no warm-up throws are taken. At USA regional meets, that often is the case.
Jerry, let me just make one more comment.
Yeah,
if just the best practice here, if you have, it's very, very rare, boys and girls in the United States, we just don't have large enough meets where we would have more than 8 in a particular class. But if you were to have more than 8, rather than go to throw 3 and then throw the next 3, up to about 12 athletes, it's going to take you less time if you are the TD or the ref to actually let them get in the chair, throw their 6 and get out for all 12 of them. And this is really a time constraint because it takes a lot of time to take the chair out, put the next chair in. So
yeah, I mean, when you're trying to make these schedules, we typically think of 12 to 15 minutes for 6 throws.
Right. And then the other comment we just want to make in this case is that if you're at a regional competition, chances are they're going to share chairs and between athletes. So you may want to just ask your athletes at the beginning of the competition who's sharing the chair, and then change the rotation so that chair is put in and all the athletes that are going to use it are going to go through that chair and then put the next chair in. These are just things that are going to make the meet go faster.
Yeah, and we have even internationally sometimes done that at bigger, higher level competitions. Allowed the referee to reorder the order of throws for the athletes to accommodate 2 chairs, especially if in the case that something happens to a chair and it broke, and they still want to compete, and somebody's going to loan them a chair. It's okay to reorder them. One other point I want to make here too is that should the athlete, and remember the athlete gets 4 minutes or 5 minutes to tie themselves down and do all their warm-ups. If they don't get themselves tied down in time, the clock goes off and it's ready to start throwing, and they still want to continue strapping themselves in, you start eating up those 1 minute throwing times for throw 1, throw 2, throw 3 until they're ready to throw. If they can't accomplish the task by the 6th throw, and if you're doing 6, then the event is over for them and they'll be assisted out of the throwing ring. Now we're going to talk about lifting, the bane of our existence as judges in seated throws. You can see there's a variety of ways to sit on the chair. You can see some examples here. You can see, do you remember her name, Phil? I don't, I apologize. But you can see this athlete sitting forward, the sector, it's like we're looking at her and we're standing in the sector. She's facing forward. You can see these gentlemen either facing and straddling both corners, or they can straddle just one corner. It doesn't really matter. That's perfectly a legal position. And we'll talk in a moment about why that is. This is rather important. This is the infamous drawing in the rule book. Lifting, to quote, lifting is a foul and is described as any movement away from the true seated position. Then you ask yourself, well, what is the definition of a seated position? The athlete's legs and posterior must be on the cushion from the back of the knee all the way back to this point on the bottom of their pelvis called the ischial tuberosity. And this fleshy part of the buttock can be off the seat, but from here to here, touching the back of the knees is a requirement for a true seated position. You can see over here, here's the cushion. From here all the way up to here, and you can see the back of the leg is away from the front of the cushion. That is not allowed. The back of the leg, back of the knee must be against the front of the cushion to consider the entire leg being level. And the reason we do this is a long time ago, we had a whole bunch of different athletes with different disabilities, and some of them could actually partially stand. So in their follow through phase of their throw, they'd partially stand up and come out of the seat. And when they competed against others who couldn't do that, it was an unfair competition. So we changed the classification system and we changed this rule. Now everybody has to be seated in this fashion, in this true seated position. One way that you can judge about where this bony prominence is on the pelvis is take the athlete and ask them if they can to lay all the way down on their legs and watch the fleshy part of their buttocks is. And when they're all the way down, you can look and see where the skin touches the seat or the cushion. Just forward of that is that bony prominence of the pelvis. So that gives you sort of a visual perspective of where it probably is. So if you see that particular point lifting up in the air during the throw, that is lifting and it's a foul. All right. Wow, that's weird.
Yeah, I know.
This is an athlete that's going to be throwing. And remember what I just told you about the position of the leg on the cushion? Watch him throw. Okay, I'm going to run it one more time real quick. Okay. This was a foul. And if you watch this guy, let me grab it and see if I can show you here. Yeah, okay. So he's getting ready to throw. Kind of leans forward. Goes back and gets ready. Look at his left knee. See his left knee coming all the way forward, completely away from the seat. That's during the preparatory phase of the throw. And then during the final throw, this knee comes forward. So it's like a seesaw. When he goes back to prepare for the throw, the left knee comes forward. When he throws, the left knee comes back against the seat and the right knee goes forward. This is probably the most classic foul you'll ever see throwing, and we see a lot. And unfortunately, you kind of ask yourself, why didn't they put a strap in front of their knees? Well, that's the cure. But unfortunately, this guy wasn't coached very well and had to disqualify several of his throws during that. You can see this is just a still picture from the video. You can see his knee way out of there. The cushion is, the front of the cushion is right about there. Typical foul. Amputees. This is a nice picture. It shows you an amputee. He's a below the knee amputee, and there's our interface for his prosthetic limb, which is sitting right here. For amputees, in terms of lifting, the remaining limb must stay on the seat, no matter how short it is. So the athlete must strap down their remaining limb, and that must remain on the seat as well during the throw. And that's from the time that the implement is handed to the athlete until the implement lands out in the field. For some of these athletes, Phil went over this a little bit earlier, just to remind you that some of these athletes, the F-35s, which are the more functional on the end of the CP range, or these athletes with and without prosthetic limbs, they're not stable. They cannot really stand very well and throw. And remember, you can't use a wheelchair or another assistive device to hold on to support you while you do your throw. So they have the option, and the classifiers will grant them this if it's appropriate, to go to the higher level F-57s. That's the end of the range of the spinal cord injury classes, or an F-34, that's the higher end of that. They will all become either F-57s or F-34s for the CPs. There's another unique implement that's actually quite popular in Europe. We don't have as many here, but we have some really good ones. You can see in this picture on the right-hand side, this athlete is throwing it and that club is flying in the air. There's a picture here and you're going, what in the heck is that athlete doing? He's backwards. Well, that's perfectly fine. It's okay to turn your chair around and throw backwards. In fact, many of these lower level athletes, these are the 31s and the 32s and the F51s. Remember, these lower numbers are the more functionally impaired. These athletes have more significant functional limitations due to their disability than the others. So this is a club. This implement was invented basically because these athletes can't hold on to a discus. So this replaces the discus for them. The only other option we really had would be to limit the number of events they had to participate in the events. It's a wood and it has a metal bottom, and there are stereotypical measurements about how you would make sure that this implement was okay in weights and measures. 4 main parts: the head, the neck, the body. It must be 397 grams at minimum. And to qualify records, it must measure between 350 to 390 millimeters in overall length. There's some flexibility in the shape of the knob and the length of the neck that's allowed for. Like I said, they can turn around backwards or face forwards or face sideways. Many different ways of throwing it, and we'll show you a couple of pictures here. This athlete on the left, you can see the sector, and he's straddling the corner. Remember those early pictures of those guys? He's straddling one corner. His right shoulder is facing out into the sector. Watch this video. Watch that again real quick. Okay, as you can see on this slide, we say that this is a valid throw. I'm betting he actually lifted, but because this net was in the way of the camera, I can't really legitimately say that. I have no evidence to say he really did. Having done seated throws for as long as I have, that would be my guess. But it's still a good example of how an athlete would throw legally. Ideally, she should probably have a strap up here holding his pelvis down on the seat. Look over here. This is a backwards throw for the club. Pretty significant athetosis. Throwing backwards, got a nice release on that. Oops. Now, for this particular athlete here, watch right here. So you can see this is the still of that. You can see there's a huge gap underneath her buttocks. From here all the way back to here, even throwing backwards and even with a strap on, she lifts her buttocks throwing backwards, which is not something you necessarily think of, but it can happen throwing club and throwing in a backwards direction. So keep an eye on that because it can and will happen. Now in Rio, we had an F32 competition for the women, and the shot put, and it was almost impossible for any of those women to throw a valid throw. I think we had 5 or 6 valid throws out of everybody that was in the competition. I think there were 7 athletes in the competition. That's pretty terrible in the Paralympics to have that happen. So we sat down and we looked at it and says, well, it's very difficult these athletes are CP athletes. And it's difficult for them to control body movement. The 31s and the 32s, it's really, really hard for the 32s to control body movement. So what happens is when they try and begin a forward movement to do a put, more often than not, their hand comes away from it, because as they try and extend their arm, the nervous input to their muscles doesn't work very well, and it works incorrectly, and their hand automatically starts to come outside and away from the chin. For you and I, that would be a foul immediately. Well, we've changed the rules. So for this, only for the sport class F32s, men and women, lateral movement of the shot away from the chin and neck is perfectly allowable. The other requirement we changed was there's no longer a requirement for that put to be a straight and continuous movement of the shot, because many of these athletes can't make a straight and continuous movement of their arm, especially as they're trying to go into what we would call an extension, straightening out the arm as you begin to push it out. We're happy that we made this change, and we're seeing competitions now where the F32s are really able to throw well and have great competition. So this is the kind of thing, we see something happen and it doesn't seem right, we review things and we make changes to the rules. We also get input from other countries, from all the countries too. We made some BI changes years ago because of input from several of the countries. Here we go. Here's a shot put for an F32, a male. Now I'll show it to you again. Happens really quickly. He's wind up, bang. All right, so he preparatory phase of the throw, he winds up. That vertical pull flexes a little bit, but I think it's still particularly legal. The rule of thumb is if the pole doesn't flex any more than the diameter of the pole, it's probably okay. It's hard to judge. So you can see his hand comes out beyond his shoulder like that, and then it goes behind his shoulder. So the rule still says that behind the shoulder is not allowed. So at this point, he was okay, according to the rule for the F32s, but at that point, behind his shoulder, that's a foul. He's doing a baseball pitch, basically. And of course, that's not allowed. And rule 31.1 pretty much dictates what's going on there. You can see his hands way back there. Whoops. Here's a female F32 thrower. We'll do this real quick. This was in London. Okay. You can, she's actually a pretty good thrower. And she sat there and sat there and sat there. The clock's ticking. She's fine. She gets ready and does a nice job of putting the shot put up next to her, kind of in an odd place, but it's still legitimate. Preparatory phase of the throw. She looks really good. And she starts to come forward. She's trying to push that shot forward at this point. And we call this a legal throw. It's right on the borderline of going behind the plane of her shoulder. But you can see she's trying to extend her arm, and she just can't get a nice fluid continuous motion. Throws up and follows through. It's a good throw. But you can see that this is really kind of difficult to call. And you remember, you're looking at lifting, you're looking at the knees coming forward. You can see she's straddling it. The point about straddling, as long as you have any part on the back of the knee, and I should have said this earlier, any part of the back of the knee that is touching the side of the seat is okay, even if it slides along. If this knee had come away from the seat, that would have been a foul. That would have been a lifting foul. But for an official to try and judge all of this, plus, you got to watch the throw too, right? That's really why they were here. It's difficult to do. So at these competitions, having two judges is almost essential to be able to do an adequate job of monitoring these athletes during their competition.
Yeah, Jerry, that's what I was going to say. I mean, in a regional competition, typically we would only have one person, and you typically almost want to position yourself where the camera was so that you can get the best view of the throw plus lifting. But in an ideal situation, one person should be assigned to lifting and the other to the throw itself, and the third to mark the implement in the field.
For sure. And at major competitions, when we actually have the luxury of having a video referee, the field referee often will call up the video referee and says, "Did you get an image?" We'll put still cameras behind the athlete looking for lifting, and we'll often have a camera out front to be able to look at the knees and then be able to monitor the movements that the athlete makes during their throw to see if it's legal. Thanks, Phil. That was great. Chair tie down device. This is an important piece. If the chair tie down devices break during the athlete attempting a throw, it's our fault as the field judging team, because remember, we're the ones that tie the chair down to the platform. It's our responsibility. However, if the straps that the athlete uses, remember, and they're not elastic at all, if those break during the throw, that equipment is the responsibility of the athlete. And should they break, that is nothing that we can deal with. Now, if the chair tie down devices do break and the athlete has the choice, they can either take the throw if they liked it, or we would give them another throw for free as soon as we repaired the straps. So they have an option that we'll give them the option of having a replacement throw, should it be our responsibility for those straps or chains. Phil mentioned loose clothing earlier. As you can see, when we're trying to look for lifting, if you have really loose pants, it's kind of hard to tell with some part of that leg or the buttock comes off the chair, because that loose clothing will mask that. You can ask the athlete to wear tight pants if it's caught in the call room, change their pants. Or typically what we'll often do is we'll have a roll of duct tape out there on the field of play, and we will tape those pants down on the athlete's leg so that we can actually make a reasonable guesstimate as to whether they're lifting or not. But that's an important piece. As normal, any powder and stuff like that that's used on the implements, it has to be removable by a wet cloth. You can't use some of those sticky substances that used to be used beforehand. We must be able to wipe it off. Number of attempts, we talked about this earlier. If the first 3 rounds are conducted in 2 or more pools, the second 3 are going to be reversed. All of the beats use the same method, but we often, and again, it's the decision of the TD and the LOC as to whether or not we will do 6 consecutive throws. At the Paralympics, no, we won't do that. We'll whittle the field down to 8 and have the 8 throw their final 3 throws. Best practices is you number the flags. We use little flags that you see for marking electrical cable in your backyard or irrigation lines. We'll mark those flags, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We'll mark them out there on the grass. We won't run the tape through the chair. We'll let them do all their throws. The athlete will exit, we'll move the chair out of the way, and then we'll measure. Of course, if we have EDM, it's a moot point because then we can measure each throw, and it does speed things up. Javelin. Javelin must land tip first for U17s and older. For the younger ones, you can mark the back of the grip if it's a flat, but only for the U11s and U14s.
Okay, answer this one. What do you think? I feel
Oh, here's a big one. The classes of the athlete determines what weight implement they use, whether it's a discus or a shot put or a javelin. And it's really, really important, especially with the shot puts, to make sure that you know what class athlete you have there at your event and what weight implement they should have. And if it's a mixed event, you have different classes in your pit. They may have different weights. So you're in your stand there, you're going to have 1, 2, or 3 different size shot puts or different size javelins, et cetera, et cetera. So you really need to be careful that you reference what the implement is that athlete's supposed to be using so that they get the right implement. With shot put, it's really easy to mess up because there are a lot of shot puts that are the same diameter but different weight. And when there's painted the same color, it's really easy to pick up a 4 kilo shot or a 3 kilo shot when you were supposed to pick up the other one. It's sometimes not really noticeable. So make sure that you check what we here do in the US, the implement weights are on the flight sheet. So it's really easy to check. If not, you've got your rule book or you've got a cheat sheet that you carry with you out onto the field of play, and that's your reference. You say, okay, I have an F57 athlete. They're going to throw a 4 kilo shot put. Make sure I get them the 4 kilo and not the 3 kilo, because then you might be filling out world record paperwork and you shouldn't be. And I say that because I've done that. So it comes from experience. It's embarrassing. If the implement is touching the sector line, of course, it's a foul. That's nothing new for you guys. One kind of rule of thumb is when you're using tapes, whether it be fiberglass or steel, the 0 point, depending on the manufacturer, sure varies. Make sure that you're using the correct 0 point when you're going out to make it. And make sure that you're, of course, reading the inside of the toe board, not the front of the toe board. And always make sure that as the tape stretches back towards the center of the circle or the javelin runway, that the tape is pulled snug and straight. Let's see.
Down now.
Okay, world records. At least 3 judges have to sign. They have to visually assess the measurement, and then they sign that they have done so. The implement is immediately taken away, and it's reweighed and checked for damage, and then returned to the event. Because anybody who puts any implement that gets put in the pool must be available to everybody. Not an issue for major competitions because typically they don't allow personal implements. For ATFUSA record forms, we only require a minimum of 2 judges to sign, and then the referee, of course, and then here the referee signs later, and then we reweigh it. The practice has been to put serial numbers on the implements, and that way that you can note that number 7 was used for this particular record, and you can check it afterwards.
Jerry, one comment. So if you talked about numbering those flags 1 through 6. Typically on a local or regional meet, the athlete's going to start with 1 implement and use it for the whole 6 throws. But there are cases where he may change, or she may change implements in the middle. So it becomes critical that you know that for throw number 2, they used the implement 6, and for throw number 6, they used implement 12. So, so we have forms that we use to keep track of that.
For sure, yeah, it is a headache. I mean, it really is. That's one part of parasport that takes a little bit of extra effort on our part as officials, is to kind of keep track of these things and make sure that the athletes are using the appropriate implement, regardless of when or how they change. And like we said, Um, EDMs can be used and it sure speeds things up. If you're using an EDM of any kind, you must calibrate that against a steel tape. We prefer a standardized steel tape. Most people don't have one unless it's a major competition because they're really expensive. But you compare the measurement of the steel tape before the event. Most people do it afterwards, but the rules are changing, and for advanced competitions, we don't necessarily require a post-event measurement to confirm that nothing changed. And that is the end.
That's
I'm
the
sorry
end.
that took so long.
We apologize for being a little long, but it takes a while to get through this. I hope you enjoyed the Phil Galley, Jerry Clayton montage. To do the test, you would click on this link here. So you would open your course material that's on the ATFUSA website, go through these and then hit that link. That'll bring you to the course. And that second link was to the, and here's a link to the test. And that second link was to that guide that will link the course with the test questions. So it'll help you get through this a little quicker. I want to go back to that other slide just for a minute, Jerry, and go one more
Stand by
slide.
one.
Yeah. Yeah, go one more slide now. I want to thank.
Oh, this one? Okay.
No, that one. Yeah, I just want to thank, we formed a para officials committee this year. It's made up of all the international technical officials in the US and all of our top para USATF officials, as well as USOPC individuals. And I want to thank them for helping the 2 or 3 months that put together this version of the course and the test. And,
yeah, a lot of work went into this, that's for sure.
Yeah, and we want to thank Joe and Lauren and World Para Athletics for lending us the videos and the pictures that are in the presentation. If you have any questions for Jerry or I, please don't hesitate to email us and we will get back to you as soon as we can. When you take the test, you will get an email back saying that you passed the test or failed the test. If you fail it, then your friend, Paul Johnson, will write you an email and send you a makeup test. If you pass it, you'll get the test that you passed. The information goes then to Paul Johnson, who will then forward that to USATF, and he forwards that to me. I put it up on Find an Officials, the Find an Officials app. And if you ever want to know whether you passed or failed the test before you get back from your association, you can always go to we update that app probably once or twice a month. So go to the app, put in your zip code. It's really easy to do, and your name should show up and tells you your information plus how many questions you got right or wrong in the test. And then for meet directors, if you're running a meet, it allows them to put in their meet zip code and find you who have passed the test from the closest to the furthest from that point, so that we can reach out to you to help us work these meets. We greatly appreciate you taking this course and passing this and broadening your experience in para athletics.
Oh yeah, thank you. Thank everyone so much for your interest in our sport. It's a lot of fun, and you see some amazing athletes, not because they're disabled, they're just really good athletes.
Yeah, and you really haven't seen anything until you've seen a crash in the 5,000.
Oh yeah, yeah. The rule of thumb is get the crash out of the way first early, and then the rest of the event goes okay.
All right.
You
Thank
guys,
you very much.
I know we're trying to sign off, and it is late for us on the East Coast, but you have a couple of questions that came in.
Okay.
And one is from Bridget. It says, can you show us how to use the table with the questions?
Oh, sure. Did you go back one slide? Can you click on that? Will that work? Yeah, you should be able to.
The test link?
Yeah, no, the course test link.
Oh, okay.
Is that going to work?
Just a sec.
This one. Yeah.
The purple one.
Yeah, the blue one.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, never mind.
So when you, yeah, it should come up, right? Okay, so this is the aid. The test question is the first column. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The second column is the page in the course that we just went through, where you should find the most of the information to answer the question correctly. The next comment is just that it's a wheelchair question and it's a field question. And the final one is the WPA rule, which is also typed on the question in the test itself. So,
Yeah. But when I try to do this, it depends how you do it. Like when I downloaded it on my computer, and it either you do it a PDF or print, and the pages are different. So which was the best way to do it?
I don't know. What can we do
Yeah.
that
This is
after?
the
send me
page
an
number, not the slide number, correct?
the page
Are you-
number. Yeah, it's the page number in the course, right? And the page numbers are on the bottom of each page in the course.
So that's
the
the page
course
number
that-
on the PDF version.
Yeah, in the PDF version, correct. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, it is confusing. Sorry about that, but
Yeah, no, I'm telling
we
you,
can't
it's,
distribute the slides, so.
yeah, it's a lot better than before we had this, because now at least you know where in the course that we covered tonight, you should find the answer for the question.
Yeah, so for question 1, you go to page 56 in the PDF.
Yeah,
And if you have your WPA rule book downloaded, it's rule 36.1, .2, and .3.
right. In some cases, the WPA rule it has some ambiguities, and so the course page will clear it up.
Yeah, rules
Thank you.
tend to be purposely vague to make it a little bit easier to give rules. But what's nice about the new rule books, both World Athletics and WPA, have that green section after the rules that give you, this is how to interpret everything. So if you're trying to figure out how something works, definitely read the green part after the particular rule you're looking at. It's very useful information.
Okay, let's move on from that, but
Yep.
so we had a question about the club, asking from where do you measure the club landing? They said where any part of the club first hits the ground was the question.
Right.
Wonderful question. Phil, you want to take that one?
Yeah, no, it's just like it's very similar to the discus. So if it hits tip first, then measure the tip. If it hits tail first, measure the tail. And I've never really seen it be flat. It's either one or the other, but wherever it hits first, you measure that just like you measure the discus.
Great question, though. We should have told you that. Our bad.
And then, and I haven't scrolled down yet, but I think the other outstanding question is going back to a slide in the first part of the presentation. Can you repeat the rule regarding an athlete viewing pictures of previous trials? I remember a clarification was given regarding where a coach could hold a device with pictures.
Okay, I can easily do that. I can't remember the rule number. I could look it up, but it would take some time. The rule indicates that the coach or whoever is in the stands can talk to the athlete, and with permission, the athlete can actually walk across the track and go stand next to the wall and talk to his or her coach. And if they've been taking video and they want to show the athlete what their last throw looked like, and talking about form and things like that, they can do that. However, if they lean over the wall with the camera in their hand and that camera is suddenly inside the field of play, the competition area, that is not allowed. So hopefully that makes sense.
Great. There was a question about how do you obtain the World Para Athletics rulebook? Do you just want to tell them where to find that online?
Yeah, it's in this course. On the first page or the second page, there's a hyperlink to it. as well as if you went to ATFUSA.org's website, in the left-hand column, there are tabs. And so in this case, on this page 3, it's the hyperlink is right there. In the USATF website, they have a hyperlink that goes to this page also. And my last tip is that if you go to the ATF USA website and you go to the front page of the website, on the left-hand side, there are tabs, and one of those tabs is rules. And if you click on that, you'll come to this exact same page, and then you can hyperlink to the rule book.
Wonderful.
And
And
the
if
rule
all
book-
else fails, if you do Google World Para Athletics rules, you will also find that link. It's #1.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Pretty
absolutely.
Googleable.
yeah, it's just that I get confused and it doesn't always work. So these are much easier to go to quickly. Go ahead.
I think that's it. I think there were some questions about obtaining copies of these slides or some of the other things you recommended. So I can answer that, like Phil said, if you go to atfusa.org on the left-hand side and then go to officials resources or officials,
Corner.
and you'll find all this information in there. And
Yeah,
if you
you
can't
find it
find it, you can shoot an email. I shared Phil and Jerry's email in the chat. So if any of you need to reach out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's if you go to the officials corner, it'll say to take the course, and you'll download the PDF of what we demonstrated, what we went through tonight. So you'll have everything, and you'll have all the video hyperlinks to the videos that we showed.
Yeah, again, feel free to reach out and contact us about trying to understand some of these rules. We went through a lot today, but hopefully this will put you in a good position to do well on the test. And again, we are so excited to have all of you join us in para athletics. We're happy to have you.
It's
Okay. And so I think that's it. And thank you everyone for joining us. And if you, after taking the test, you're looking for a para meet to work, I don't want to not mention Move United has sanctioned competitions throughout the US. We're still pretty early in the season thanks to COVID. So if you go to the moveunitedsport.org website, at the moment it's hidden under the sports heading. You'll find the 2021 sanctioned competitions list. And I encourage you to reach out to event directors of events in your area and just ask to work. And I'm sure they'll be happy to have you. So thank you everyone for joining us and have a great week.